The world of COVID has really turned upside down what we understand in terms of our experiences, and that has happened in two really important ways. So first of all, it's really disrupt what is familiar, and that disruption is really important psychologically because it creates uncertainty so that normal rules do not apply in this situation, and therefore, how do we go forward? And the second aspect that's really important there is in terms of vulnerability. So this idea that somehow the experiences that we're having change how vulnerable we feel, because we never thought that that might happen, and now suddenly it's happening, and what are we going to do about it? So as a result of this, what we see is really that trust becomes a much more salient concern for individuals. And why does that matter in terms of organisations? Well, I would contend, I'm just going to put Mark down here, if that's all right, that it really is important because it can alter our psychological attachment to our employing organisation. So first of all, particularly as Billy was talking there, our notion, particularly with the COVID experiences of that remote working. So suddenly our identities are changed in terms of where we work, and the status and other aspects of our work are changed because we're working in our bedrooms often rather than in our workplaces and our corner suites. It also changes our commitment, and through that it can also change our trust because it starts to have an impact on what we're taking for granted there. And so in particular, what we're seeing is that there are, I would argue, three areas of growing distrust in organisations. So first of all, what we've seen often in employers' responses is this shift to being distrustful, so that they start to put in particularly monitoring and surveillance systems so that they can start to collect different types of information around people. But that actually is conveying, as the others, Guido spoke about this, that's conveying that you don't trust somebody, and what are the consequences then of them. Also, increasingly, what we've seen with organisations is that they've started to partially share their information with individuals as a way of protecting the employer. And so we see that with engineering groups, whereby they kind of ring fence part of their story rather than sharing it more widely. And also we've seen this in changes to that employment relationship, particularly around the growth of precarious work and around wages, and particularly into minimum wages. And we've done a lot of work more recently looking at living wages and how that might be a really important antidote here. The second issue coming through here is that we've had unexpected trust breaches. And so those have created very unexpected and rapid, unpredictable changes in terms of how we see our organisations. And that has created important fault lines. Particularly, I'm thinking here about, I'm going to say the B word, the Brexit word, leavers and remainers. So it's created this separation of people. We've also got it in terms of people reinterpreting previous experiences, and we saw that over the summer with issues like Black Lives Matter, where suddenly we see that one person's experiences around what one group might take as trustworthy are suddenly thrown up into the air in a different way, and we suddenly see that their vulnerability is much changed. And we've got a paper at the minute where we're looking at a US population and comparing whites, blacks and Muslims' experiences of the police and how much they trust the police. And then finally, another way that this distrust can come out is because it has two aspects and two consequences for us. So first of all, it can create this negative affective tone, which alters significantly our sense of cognition, and particularly our openness of cognition. And secondly, I don't know about you, but I've certainly been very much overwhelmed at particular times through this set of experiences. And so the second way that it can happen is that it can overwhelm our means to self-regulate. So we start behaving in ways that maybe are very inconsistent for us, and therefore we breach trust inadvertently because of what's going on for us. So in particular, our work that looked at organisational change really highlighted these important, and you can see on your screen, these 4 ways that organisations start to shift from trust decline into distrust building through things like inconsistent leadership, through things like people feeling that the systems and processes for them somehow become more unfair, and then finally in terms of this communication and unpredictable working environment, which we've all seen. As a result of that, you get this shift where people start to perceive if there has been a particular breach, and particularly around whether somebody's integrity, so that kind of core element, which I'm sure Cicely can talk a bit more about. But through that, you get this cycle of disengagement starting, which ends up in counterproductive work behaviours as people morally disengage. So they separate their cognitive selves from what's going on around them. And so what we found in particular in terms of paying attention to this is that often organisations are failing to value trust. They don't see the need to celebrate and to maintain trust, and so they fail to pay attention to these 3 building blocks that we've identified. They fail to give people space and time to emote the experiences that they're having, particularly their negative experiences and their negative emotions following that. And often, at odds with what Billy was talking about, they fail to give other people a sense of agency in this situation, and so people start to feel less trustworthy because they feel that they're not part of what's going forward and that their important decisions aren't coming to the fore. And so leaders really play a critical role in this, as Cicely's highlighted, but particularly that benevolence, that kind of servant nature of leaders is a critical factor here. So I would argue that often organisations are failing to look at this and honour it. So we might say, as the Dutch would, trust arrives on foot, but it leaves on horseback. And I would argue for our society going forward, it may have some very enduring consequences in terms of the separation that we feel from other people, in terms of exposing also the kind of shallowness for some people's and the precarity of some people's lives that's very much at odds with others. And so my takeaways would be, we really need to understand why trust is important and how the salience of it is increased. Also to try and look at processes and where we can step in to engage and pull back, rather than having a full distrust starting in organisations, and really starting to understand much more about that person-centric view. So how people see their experiences, and the fact, we've done a load of work looking at trust audits in firms, and the thing that always surprises senior people in organisations is that junior people view the organisation often entirely differently in terms of trust. So we really need to start pulling that more together. And these are just 3 papers that kind of are highlighting different aspects of trust that you might be interested in looking at.